Hi, everybody. This is Peter Schiff. It is Friday, August 2nd, 2013. Earlier this morning, we got the release of the July non farm payrolls. The original estimate, the consensus, was for the creation of 185,000 jobs. Although by early this morning, I think most of the people on Wall Street had already gotten their hopes up, and I think most people were looking for a number north of 200,000. Not that 200,000 is even that strong, but that's what people were looking for. Well, once again, they were disappointed. The actual number came in at 163,000 jobs, considerably below what the consensus had been, certainly way below the more optimistic consensus that seemed to be growing. Also, the government revised downward the prior couple of months. I think it was about 35,000 jobs that they previously reported had been created. Now they said, actually, on second thought, we didn't create those jobs at all. But again, even beneath the surface, the numbers get worse. Both hours worked and wages fell on the month. More people left the labor force. That's why the unemployment rate ticked down to 7.4% from 7.5%. And the labor force participation rate also went down back to 63.4 from 63.5. And if you look at the household survey, which is an alternate measure, according to the household survey, only 35% of all the jobs created in July were full-time jobs. The other 65% were part-time jobs. And in fact, if you look at that survey all the way from the beginning of 2013, 77% of the jobs that were created this year were part-time, low-paying jobs. That's what's going on. The American economy is being transformed from a full-time economy to a part-time economy. That is why I believe that the economy is actually contracting, not expanding the way the government would want us to believe. Which brings me to the GDP numbers that came out earlier this week. We got those on Wednesday. Now, here, the consensus was looking for, I think, 1% or maybe even 0.9. And the reports came out that, hey, the GDP came out better than estimate. We got 1.7. I think it was actually 1.67, but they rounded it up to 1.7. And that was the headline, right? GDP better than expected. But buried beneath the headline was the fact that the first quarter, because remember, this is second quarter, first quarter GDP was revised all the way down to 1.1. Now, when the government first told us about Q1 GDP, it was at 2.5. And that was a headline then. Hey, the economy grows at 2.5. Of course, that didn't happen. Now we found out that it was only 1.1, only that's buried beneath the new headline of 1.7. Now, my guess is that within a few months, that 1.7 number is going to be revised downward quite a bit. My guess is it's going to end up being a lot closer to zero than 2%. But of course, by then we'll get another bogus number that they'll later revise downward. The government always comes out with a number, or most of the time, that's too big. And by the time they revise it down, nobody pays attention. Well, I'm paying attention. But what's even worse, if you look at the deflator that the government used in Q2, right? And again, the deflator is how you adjust nominal GDP for inflation, right? And according to the government, inflation on an annualized rate, right, for the whole year was 0.7% during the second quarter. 0.7%. That's it. Now, I don't believe that for a nanosecond. In fact, inflation is a lot higher than that. I mean, it's much higher than 2%. It's probably higher than 5%. Exactly where it is, I don't know. But what I know for sure is there's not a chance that it's 0.7. Now, if the government used an accurate deflator, then I believe that we already would have reported a negative quarter for the second quarter of 2013. The economy would be contracting. Now, when I try to bring this up, as I did recently on CNBC on the Kudlow Show, in fact, on my video blog, if you didn't see it live, you can catch this. But I was trying to point out that the government was lying about inflation, and to disprove me, the other person I was debating, although I was debating both Larry Kudlow and my opponent, but he pointed out, well, I must be wrong, because if inflation really is as high as I think, then the economy is contracting and not expanding. And I said, yeah, right, exactly. But then he said, but we're creating all these jobs. How can we be doing that if the economy is contracting? Well, you can create jobs in a contracting economy. You know, if people are becoming so poor that they need to work harder, maybe the retired people have to come out of retirement. But I think what's going on is people who used to have full-time jobs now have part-time jobs, and maybe their employers are hiring an additional part-time worker. So the fact that we're creating all these part-time, low-paying jobs, to me, is consistent with a shrinking economy. If the economy really were expanding the way the government wants us to believe, then we would be creating quality full-time jobs. So I don't see any inconsistency. I think the economy is much weaker than the numbers show, and I think inflation is much higher. And here's why. It's because the government continuously changes the methodology for reporting these numbers. The best example now is the GDP itself, because the GDP numbers we got this week, this is the first time that the government computed GDP using its new methodology. Now, what is the difference between the way the government used to report GDP and the way it's doing it now? Well, GDP, by definition, go back to Econ 101, is consumption plus business investment plus government spending, and then plus or minus net exports, which for us is always a minus because we have a trade deficit. Now, what they decided to do is add something to investment that previously had never been considered investment. And by doing this, the government, with a stroke of a pen, added almost 500 billion, I think it was 400 and change billion, to the size of our economy. So now the government is telling us the economy is much bigger than what they used to tell us. Now, why did they do this? Well, I think they did it because they wanted the GDP to be bigger. But now it's not the same GDP. Investment spending is supposed to be when businesses spend money on a capital good. Now, what a capital good is, as opposed to a consumer good, a capital good is an instrumental good. It's a good that you don't want for itself, but for the other goods that it can produce. Whereas a consumer good is the good that you want. So if you take the example of the, hypothetical widget manufacturer, if I, as a widget manufacturer, spend money on a new widget making machine, that money I spent to buy that machine is capital investment. The widgets that the machine makes, well, those are consumer goods because that's what everybody wants. Nobody wants the widget machine. They just want the widgets that the machine makes. So when I spend money on a widget machine, that is added to the GDP as investment. Now, there's another concept called net GDP, which no one ever talks about, which takes into account the depreciation of those capital investments, which you need to do. Because first you make an investment, it doesn't last forever. Over time, it depreciates, and that's why you need more capital investment to compensate for what you lose to depreciation. Now, of course, if I have a worker who operates that widget machine, his salary to operate the machine is not a capital investment. It's an expense. It's wages. But it gets counted in GDP when he goes and spends his paycheck. Now, here's the change. It has to do with intangibles. I'll just use one example for the purpose of this video blog, motion pictures. The government is saying that all the money that a studio spends producing a movie, all the money, the entire budget, is now going to be considered capital investment in business investment. But it's not. The movie is a consumer good. That's what everybody wants. We want to watch the movie. It is not an investment to have a movie, right? The investment would be the camera equipment that they buy to shoot the movie, the sound equipment that they buy, because that equipment can be used to make many movies, not just the original, this movie, but movies in the future. And nobody wants a movie camera because they want the camera. They want the movies that the camera shoots. So the camera is the instrumental good. The film is the consumer good. Now, if the production company has to hire somebody to operate the camera, that's the salary. That's an expense. That's not the capital investment. But according to the new way of calculating GDP, that's now an investment. The entire budget, if they hire Tom Cruise and they pay him $20 million, that $20 million that they pay Tom Cruise is now considered business investment. But it's not. It's Tom Cruise's salary. That money is going to be counted anyway when he blows it on sports cars and whatever he spends his money on. I mean, he's a big spender, right? That's going to go into the GDP anyway. Now we are going to count it again. Now, the government is trying to make believe that, well, the movie is just like a factory or a piece of equipment because motion picture companies, well, they can license the movie. They get revenues, for years and years and years. And so therefore it's an investment. No, it's not. Look, there are plenty of goods that are produced that are rented out, leased out, that generate recurring revenue streams. That doesn't change the nature of what it is from a consumer good to a capital good. So this is bogus. Plus, of course, not all movies generate a lot of revenue in the future. Some movies bomb, right? They don't generate a lot of revenue. Some movies are so bad they never even get released. If a studio spends $10 million on a movie that is so bad that nobody ever sees it, they still get to add that 10 million as investment. Now, the government actually spent money going all the way back to 1929 to redo all the GDP calculations in order to incorporate this change. Now, I don't know why academic economists are not up in arms saying, hey, this is not right. You're changing GDP. It's no longer what it used to be. Now, not that I think GDP is the greatest way to measure economic growth. I don't, but that's the subject of another video blog. But if you're going to believe in GDP, what we have now, what the government is now reporting is not GDP. It's something brand new that the government just made up. But they're going to pretend it's GDP. But why did they go through all the effort and all the expense to redo this? Because by doing it this way, the GDP is now bigger, right? They have changed the methodology of calculating GDP to produce a bigger number. Now, why does the government want a bigger number? To make the economy look like it's bigger. And therefore, if you take a look at all of our debt relative to our GDP, it looks like the debt is now a smaller portion of the GDP because we've magically made the GDP bigger. Also, I think there's another reason. The entertainment industry, movies, television, records, all of this intellectual stuff, this is certainly part of the U.S. economy that is growing. And I think what the government wants to do is magnify the impact on the GDP of the parts that it likes, while minimizing the impact of other parts like legitimate manufacturing and investment, right? So what's going to happen is now I believe that the GDP, because of these changes, will grow faster than it would have had they not made these changes. It's kind of like they hedonically adjusted the GDP. Now, the government wouldn't have done this if it was going to produce a lower GDP. They only did it because it was going to give them a bigger number, which is what they do with everything. That's what they do with inflation, except this time it's a lower number. They keep changing the way they calculate inflation to get a lower number. They do the same thing with the way they calculate unemployment. They keep changing how they calculate unemployment so it shows that fewer people are unemployed. So whenever the government wants to report numbers that are good if they're low, then they find ways to calculate them to make it lower. The same thing when it's a big number. With GDP, we want a bigger number. So we keep finding new ways of calculating it to make the number bigger. This is all propaganda. None of this is real, but for some reason, the financial community, academia, they just accept this without question. And if anybody like me points to these figures and says they're not honest, then I'm a conspiracy nut. And it's more than just the methodology for computing it, it's how they report it. You'll notice when they report GDP, they take the growth for the quarter and multiply it by 4. So for example, let's say the economy is growing grew in the quarter by 1/4%, that quarter. They're not going to say GDP up 1/4%. They annualize it. They say GDP was up 1%. But when it comes to something like inflation, when they report the monthly inflation numbers, let's say it's 0.5% for that month. They don't annualize it. They don't multiply by 12 and say inflation is 6%. No. They leave the little number and say 0.5% because that doesn't sound like a lot. 6% sounds like a lot. 0.5 doesn't sound so bad. So it's all propaganda from compilation to reporting. And this just proves it with this recalculation, redefining what GDP actually is for the sole purpose of manipulating the numbers to create the false illusion that the American economy is getting bigger while the government ignores the real reasons why it's getting smaller. So instead of looking at the Fed policy and regulatory policy and tax policy as the source of our contracting economy, they just find a way to sugarcoat the data so that they can pretend it's actually growing even though it's shrinking. Now, the final thing I want to mention on this video was the Federal Reserve. On Thursday, between these two releases, the Fed came out, Ben Bernanke made a statement. Of course, everybody has been expecting Ben Bernanke to announce the beginning of the tapering, right? Now, I've said since day one, he has no intention of tapering. He just can't say that. He has to pretend that he's going to taper, because if he tells the truth that he can never do it, that there's no exit strategy, then there'll be a crisis. So he has to maintain the pretense that we have a viable economy and that it's not going to be QE infinity. Well, when Ben Bernanke came out, he gave absolutely no indication of tapering beginning. All he said is that the $85 billion in monthly QE is going to continue. But he said one more thing, too, that I've been warning about. He mentioned that the fact that inflation is so low, right? Because again, the way the government reports it, it's almost non-existent. He said this low inflation is problematic. And if we don't see a pickup in price increases soon, well, then that's troubling and the Fed might have to do something. What I said all along is that Ben Bernanke is in the process of laying a foundation for increasing the size of the QE. He can't say that that's what I'm going to do. He has to pretend that his mind was changed based on the data, that he thought the economy was strong enough to taper, but now, based on inflation being so low, he can't take that chance, so he has to continue to QE. In fact, he might even have to increase it. Now, apart from the obvious ridiculousness of a statement that inflation is not high enough and that it needs to be higher, that the Fed is now responsible for creating inflation, not fighting it, it's all a lie. Ben Bernanke is just looking for an excuse to justify what he wants to do anyway, which is print more money, but he can't say that. He can't come out and say the economy is so addicted to my monetary heroin that if I even give a little less of the drug, that it's going to be, we're going to be in a rehab. We're going to be hung over and strung out, right? That the economy can't handle it. In fact, just like a drug, the economy needs more and more of it. It builds up a tolerance. So the Fed is going to have to supply the economy with bigger doses of this QE just to maintain the high, because that's how important it is to the phony economy. So Ben Bernanke can't say that, so he pretends. And everybody is looking, we're all waiting for tapering, right? When is tapering going to come? It's like that play, Waiting for Godot. Tapering is never going to come. Ben Bernanke just is going to pretend and keep everybody waiting. Yes, it might come in a few months. It might not. They can't be specific because they can't actually do it. And I think what really frightens Ben Bernanke is that he actually tapers and then he has to reverse because the economy starts to implode, right? Mortgage interest rates rise. The banks are in trouble because of rising rates. The government's in trouble. Now the Fed has to reverse course. That would be very embarrassing for the Fed to have to do that. So I think the easiest thing for the Fed to do is to continue to pretend that it's going to taper, even though it has no intention of doing it, and then keep on making up, plausible excuses as to why it has to delay the tapering that supposedly it had intended all along. But in my opinion, the Fed will never do that until the markets give it no choice, right? Until we have a currency crisis, collapse in the dollar, sovereign debt crisis, then maybe the Fed will act responsibly. But up until that point, it will never act responsibly. It's going to keep on delaying the day of reckoning by printing and printing and printing as much as it can for as long as it can while pretending pretending it has some kind of exit strategy and it has the situation under control, that there's some kind of method to its madness. There is no method. It's just madness. And of course, I know that Ben Bernanke's term is coming to an end. And, people are wondering who's going to replace him. Is it going to be Janet Yellen? Is it going to be Summers? They've asked me who's going to replace him. It doesn't even make a difference to me, right? It's like asking me, hey, how do you prefer to be executed? Do you want the firing squad or do you want the guillotine? I mean, it really doesn't make a difference to me which one I choose. Maybe Yellen is probably the worst choice, right, of the bunch. And that's why I think that she's probably going to get the nod, because I'm confident that if the president makes a choice at all, whichever is the worst one, that's the direction that he's going to go. So it'll probably be Yellen, but it doesn't even matter, because whoever they appoint will probably be even worse than Bernanke, because that's the direction. It used to be that Alan Greenspan was the worst Fed chairman ever, but now Ben Bernanke has let Greenspan off the hook, because now Bernanke is the worst Fed chairman ever. So maybe he's hoping that Yellen will let him off the hook by doing the same favor for him that he did for Greenspan, so that history will record that she was the worst Fed chairman ever. And since she would be the first female Fed chairman ever, that might not go over too well with the feminists. But I guess that's another thing. But I'm running out of time. Remember, keep watching me and listening to my radio show every day, every weekday, 10 a.m. to noon. I do the radio show for 2 hours on Schiff Radio.com. So don't forget to tune in. Bye for now.